Thanks, Jeremy, and well done for staying the course. I was saying to Stephen, this could be a bit like the graveyard shift, but we'll motor on through. And thank you for staying this late in the afternoon. So the title of my paper is Building Back Better and the Search for Values, Critically Reclaiming Temple's Social Thought for a Post-Pandemic Policy Landscape. As has been said by several previous speakers today, part of what we celebrate today is William Temple's genius in linking public policy to core Christian beliefs and values. For example, he makes extensive use of the doctrines of original sin, creation, and incarnation in his arguments for a post-war welfare state. He dared to believe, and indeed argue, amid a fairly highly secularized mid-20th century, that theological and philosophical ideas should be in direct conversation with policy, because without them, one only deals with problems and solutions on a technical and empirical basis. One rarely goes upstream, as it were, to contest and alter the course of the flow of ideas and assumptions that then assume the status of deadening and sometimes dangerous normativity. I imagine Temple's social thought as a faithful but slightly battered radio transmitter, still sending out radio waves of ideas and thinking over the past 80 years. For long periods of that time, the pulse feels weak and intermittent, with lots of background hiss and noise that comes and goes as you travel the policy terrain. One could argue, for example, that the late 80s to the early 2000s was such a period when the pulse of Temple's thinking was largely ignored or neglected. But then you turn a corner, and suddenly the signal becomes bright. So the thesis I want to explore is that on the 80th anniversary of Christianity and social order, well, the question I want to raise with you is, are we turning such a corner, where the music of Temple's thought suddenly becomes clearer and more insistent? And for me, that corner represents a new alignment of religion, spirituality, activism, and values, which I'll go on to explain during this paper. And so the invitation from Temple to go upstream and alter the flow of political and policy ideas using the resources of theological and philosophical thinking has, perhaps ironically, never been so urgently needed and timely. So I'm going to develop this idea with reference to three lines of evidence, or rather three waves of what I would call a re-emergence of interest in religion and spirituality and belief in the world of policy and politics. And they all start at the turn of the millennium, I think is quite a significant historical idea. So the first wave is clearly, I would say, post 9/11. The Al-Qaeda attack on the Twin Towers in New York rapidly shifted the dial about what people were thinking about religion and belief in the West, particularly. In the wake of a panic as to what to do about religion, a slew of government and think tank reports emerged in the early noughties, reminding policymakers and a startled wider public that faith groups were essential sources of motivation and delivery of goods and services to local communities and generators of social capital, community cohesion, and resilience. So the titles of some of these reports give you a flavor of the debate at the time: faith, hope, and participation. Faith in urban regeneration, ? And then faith as social capital, connecting or dividing. And I think that last title in particular says that whilst there was a kind of, if you like, newfound appreciation for the role of religion and belief in public life, there was still widespread suspicion of proselytization, and that faith groups had an ulterior motive in offering social care and community development. So policy guidelines therefore insisted that any faith-based motivation, a motivational energy that I've described previously as spiritual capital, was edited out of partnerships partnership discussions or funding proposals. Renewed interest in faith and religion at this time, I would argue, therefore, was largely instrumentalised and broadly regarded with suspicion, and worked on essentialised binaries of either very good religion or very bad religion. This tendency reached its nadir, I think, with the emergence of the Prevent agenda, which inevitably stigmatised whole British Muslim communities and led to spikes in hate crime and Islamophobia. So that's the first wave of this return back to an interest in religion and belief. The second wave, I think, follows the great financial crash of 2007-8 and the subsequent policies of austerity, which lasted almost a decade across Europe and the UK. In 2011, John Atherton, John Reeder, and myself wrote a short book to mark the 70th anniversary of the writing of Christianity and Social Order. In it, we argued that a wary secular accommodation of religion and belief in the public square was giving way to a more naturalised welcoming of the role of faith in shaping a response to the challenges of austerity and inequality. Key to this new approach was the influential thinking of the German social theorist Jürgen Habermas. He had observed the re-emergence of religion as a global geopolitical force towards the end of the 20th century, as well as recognising the extent to which religious ideas and wisdom were now required to help save the project of the European ideal of the liberal democratic state from its own neoliberalism. Habermas proposed it was time for the West to move from a secular imagination of the public square, in which the secular was neutral and public and religion private, to a post-secular one, in which the vigorous continuation of religion in a continuously secularizing environment must be reckoned with. This conceptual move not only acknowledged that the public square was made up of both religious and secular dispositions, it also opened up the possibility of a more porous and less binary and hierarchical understanding of the relationship between the religious, the spiritual, and the secular. By the end of the book, at the end of our book, we were cautiously optimistic that these trends were starting to signal a deeper rapprochement between faith-based and secular institutions and individual actors. A proposition well captured by the following quote describing post-secularity as, quotes, a coming together of citizens who might previously have been divided by differences in theological, political, or moral principles, a willingness to work together to address crucial social issues in the city, and in doing so put aside other frameworks of difference involving faith and secularism. The third wave, I think, begins probably 2019 and is working its way through. And it's a combination of responses to the pandemic and what we're now understanding about Generation Z. Excuse me while I just get some water. So I believe we are on the cusp of an exciting third wave of religious and spiritual engagement in public life, which could take partnership and collaboration between the religious and secular to a new policy level. So two drivers are contributing to this third wave. The first has been the deep and intensive collaboration generated by some local authorities and faith groups in response to COVID-19. Commissioned research for the APPG, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Faith and Society, which I have led, approached all 408 local authorities across the UK during the first lockdown. Headline stats from that survey concluded that 67% of local authorities reported an increase in partnership working since the pandemic started. 91% said their experience of pandemic partnership with faith groups or faith-based organisations was either very positive or mostly positive. And 76% said they expected the partnership to continue on either current practices or on a more enhanced basis in the future. So I'm writing a follow-up report covering the second and third lockdowns. It's a more focused piece of research involving 35 in-depth interviews with senior local authority and faith group leaders on the front line of service delivery in lockdown Britain or pandemic Britain. In it, there is a deeply shared observation between both cohorts of the importance of sharing values of what really matters, and recognizing that sharing these values increases the possibility of generating shared outcomes. There is a strong desire to ensure that the learning and experience of deeper and more effective partnerships, what in the reports we call the new normal, is not lost in an unconditional return to pre-pandemic assumptions, hierarchies and waste, what we would call the old normal. As I've written in the report's conclusion, COVID-19 has heightened the need for more authentic, participatory and dynamic forms of governance and decision-making that is both pragmatic and flexible, but also more explicitly values-led. In a values-led economy, outcomes are framed with perhaps unusual words uncovered by this data to describe the hallmarks of a good partnership between local authorities and faith groups. Words such as kindness, empathy, compassion, motivation, hope, friendship. This possibly new and unfamiliar vocabulary or lexicon might nevertheless yet come more into the policy mainstream as the UK attempts to build back better after COVID-19. So that's one evidence base where we're seeing a strong return to values as the basis of policy. The second driver is more cultural and generic, but I think is just as influential. And the second driver comes for what is represented for this third wave is what is represented by the cultural and political influence of millennials, but in particular Generation Z or post-millennials, and their approach to identity formation and meaning-making. Post-millennials, being born into an entirely digital age, enjoy often seamless interactions between the digital world and IRL in real life. The digital world offers endless opportunities for self-expression and exploration of identities, which can be granular, intersectional, and continually updated. Fluidity and hyperdiversity are prized characteristics. The key element holding these disparate identities together is the notion of authenticity, being true to yourself and living your life in the way that you choose. Recent research on this quest for self-identity reflects post-millennials' approaches to this. Gen Zers, post-millennials, feel the need to be honest, not hypocritical, especially in relation to ethnic and gendered communities with which they identify and therefore claim belonging. The importance post-millennials attach to values and beliefs flow from this commitment to authenticity. In telling the story of who I am, my values and beliefs are now an integral element of that story. I am the sum part of my authentic beliefs, and they help explain not only who I am, but also why I act like I act. This means that post-millennials expect and value notions of hospitality, tolerance, openness, empathy, respect, and interconnectedness, both for themselves, but more crucially, they expect it from other people. The strong post-millennial attachment to values is also derived from a pervasive sense that theirs is the generation to put right the current catastrophes being visited on the world from the selfishness and complacency of previous generations, the so-called OK Boomer syndrome. As Katz et al. Say, post-millennials tend to feel skeptical about institutions and are largely disillusioned with what they have inherited from their elders and feel the burden to sort out the messed up world which they have inherited. And a widespread re-engagement with spirituality and re-enchantment is a strong element in this quest for authenticity and reconnection, and is often expressed in a revival of interest in indigenous cultures. So that's the kind of social context, political context, which I think has been building up steadily since the millennium. So the question to ask, the key question we need to ask at a conference like this is, so where and how, if how, does Temple's social thought fit into this fluid, values-rich, and post-secular landscape? As we've already discussed, I think in questions raised to previous papers, any critical reclaiming of Temple's social thought starts with acknowledging the profound shift in cultural context between his era and our own. He writes from a highly secularized context where there is, however, still enough residual belief in the efficacy of hierarchies, institutions, and elites to ensure that his voice resonates into the political and policy space. Ironically, the current post-secular zeitgeist is more confused and wary of its secular legacy. It is more suggestible to propositions about the efficacy of religion, belief, and spirituality because of their perceived links to the search for authenticity and re-enchantment, so prized by millennial and post-millennial experience. The downside is that the institutions, hierarchies, and elites that Temple appeals to in his thinking are the antithesis of those that most post-millennials aspire to. One glaring example of this mismatch is Temple's thinking on intermediate groups. So I thought I'd just do one case study of how we might take a key category of Temple's thinking and see if it lands in the current space as I've described it. So in Christianity and Social Order, Temple says intermediate groups are spaces located between the individual and the state, where we learn to be relational and participate in civic life and politics, and where we experience and perhaps learn to respect the innate dignity of every human being made in God's image. It is in these spaces that we potentially learn that true participative democracy relies on the notion of freedom for, rather than freedom from, others, i.e., we find our true sense of self-worth, dignity, and personality when we allow ourselves to be there for others and in some way allow their needs and experience to have some claim on our own. In intermediate groups, Temple asserts that we can feel as though we count for something, that others depend on us as we on them. And his examples range from the nuclear family, which we've already talked about, through to the church or congregation, professional association, the trade union, school, university, and the mutual improvement society, whatever one of those was. However, these rather institutionalized and hierarchical forms of belonging tend to affront post-millennial aspiration. From their perspective, one's family, or fam, is based on a sense of authentic affinity, not genetics. These fams are fluid and flexible, heterogeneous rather than homogeneous, hierarchically flat rather than hierarchically stacked. And yet early evidence suggests that they do perhaps fulfill some of Temple's vision for intermediate groups. They mediate the space between the individual and the state, and sometimes the market. They are spaces where we learn to relate to others who are different and do so on the potential basis of hospitality and openness to otherness and difference. We can use these spaces to explore and reimagine our sense of intertwined fates and the desire to reconnect to each other and creation as an antidote to the pervasive loneliness and fragmentation of a neoliberalized modernity, the roots of which the pandemic has ruthlessly exposed. There may be other places where Temple's social thought can resonate in our online and offline public spaces, now shaped by the pandemic and a new war in Europe. One would have to apply the same hermeneutical rigor of context, but for example, as we've already said, How might Temple's derivative principles of freedom, fellowship and service, as the basis of a just and inclusive social order, now land in today's fluid and anxious world, desperately seeking reconnection to deeper values and principles? I wanted to offer a case study of some community listening circles as an example of what I would say is a fluid intermediate group, but I'll have to save that for the paper itself. So to my conclusion. You can just read that slide. That gives you a flavour of what I was going to offer as a case study, but time is moving on. So my conclusion. If Temple was writing Christianity and Social Order now, would he spend a third of it justifying why the church should interfere? I don't think so, because I think the church and most faith groups are pushing on open doors at the moment. Instead, I would suspect he would use that space to encourage the church and other faith groups to model confident but non-hubristic leadership by curating spaces of authentic activism, volunteering and belonging. Here, shared values of offering hospitality, welcoming diversity, and exploring authenticity and spiritual re-enchantment can be rediscovered and reflected on through shared conversations and actions. In short, I think, this is what building back better looks like. Thank you.